to kind of talk about, to set kind of the tone and give you an update on what I've been learning. I've been trying to keep my research up. Everything seems to be changing. It all changes at once, and then we'll go like a week without any new information, right? But we're figuring all this out. But I do want to leave most of today open for question and answers if you have anything particular. So it'll be up to you all on how long we will be here. If you don't have too many questions, we won't be here as long. But let me go ahead and explain just a little bit about what's been happening in our special education law world. There we go. Okay, so first of all, our great news is that Secretary DeVos did not recommend any waivers of IDEA. So I was kind of on pins and needles with that, and very pleasantly surprised that she didn't suggest any waivers. So in her actual, this is a small portion of her statement to Congress, where she says that the Department of Education is not requesting waiver authority for any of the core tenets of IDEA or 504. Most notably, they're not waiving anything about free appropriate public education or least restrictive environment. And I like some of these things she mentions here, where she explains the department's position on not issuing any of those waivers is based on the—
Jaden, I don't like this icon thing you have on my Zoom. It's not okay.
Okay, I'm going to, just for now, just for privacy of everybody's, I'm going to put everybody on mute if I can remember how to do that. There we go. And if you have a question, you will have to unmute yourself. I do welcome questions. That's what tonight's webinar is all about. So please go ahead and ask questions. You can do it in chat. You can unmute yourself and ask questions. But to get back to this, Secretary DeVos said the reasons, the principles upon which she was basing her decision not to suggest any waivers were, first of all, schools can provide education to all students, including those with disabilities. So she doesn't see it as an impossible thing to do. She does recognize, the department recognizes that health and safety of everybody has to be our first consideration, obviously. But I like, this is one of my favorite parts here. The needs and best interests of the individual student, not any system, should guide decisions and expenditures. And if you are familiar with what FAPE is, right, free appropriate public education, or FAPE, the whole tenet of FAPE is built on the concept of we have to look at the child's individual needs, not on what's available or what programs the school has in place, right? So if you've taken my course, we've talked about that before, about how the determination of goals and services have to be based on the student's needs, which is why we spend so much time developing the present level section of the IEP. That's where we define the student's needs. So we don't look at what programs the school has available and go, which one can we fit them in best? We should be basing what program the child goes to on their needs, meaning maybe we have to develop new parts of different programs, or pull this part from that program and this part from that. And that's our traditional sense of FAPE that we've always been building upon. And she kind of reiterates that here to me, where she says the needs and best interests of the individual student is what guides it, not what's available to the school district. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a further slide. I also like this fourth point here. Parents or recipients of services must be informed of and involved in decisions relating to the provision of services. So I know Clovis Unified and Fresno Unified both issued a kind of a blanket prior written statement that they sent out to all recipients of special education. And the Clovis one was a little bit more personalized. I kind of got the feeling from reading it, and I'm guessing here, that most of the document was sent out to everybody, with a small section of it individualized to your students, what they will receive during these COVID closure times. How often, like for my son, I got told how often he'd have some speech services and how often he'd be able to access his teacher online. And so, but I wasn't involved in any of those decisions, right? I wasn't invited to attend a meeting to talk about what services my son needs and what will be provided to him. So in a sense, I wonder to myself, and I don't know for sure, if some of this goes against what Secretary DeVos and the Department of Education have stated here, because I'm not sure how much of it was based on my son's individual needs, but more based on what the school was able to provide right now. And I was not part of that decision making at all. I was informed of, but I was not involved in the decision relating to cutting his services during this closure time. But then she does add this fifth tenet here. Services typically provided in person may now need to be provided through alternative methods. And maybe that means we can't get them as often. Maybe it means for my son particularly, he's not going to pay attention to the services delivered online. So maybe they won't be as meaningful to him. And I realize that means we are doing the best that we can to meet their individual needs, even if it doesn't actually meet their needs because of the restrictions we have in place right now. But I thought some of these statements that she shared were, I really appreciated that she did share them and that she reiterated them here. Okay, so, oops, I'm gonna take this off. I did a previous webinar a couple weeks ago about some timelines that were affected by a state law that was passed. So AB or SB, it's referred to as Assembly Bill or Senate Bill. It passed both houses or bodies of Congress. So, but Bill number 117, it was passed to basically say these state guidelines that we've taken and we've shortened some of the federal guidelines and created new state laws, we're waiving them. So these are just to quickly recap some areas of state law that have been affected by this. So usually when we propose an assessment plan, we have 15 days before the school district has to give us, when we ask for our child to be assessed, the school district has 15 days to give us as parents an assessment plan. Well, those 15 days that clock won't even start till after the closures end, right? So that's something we're saying during this time of school closure days, of these COVID closure days, we're not gonna count those as part of the 15 calendar days. And that carries through to us receiving that plan, the school putting it together. This third one here is when we ask for copies of our students' educational file, right? Usually under state law, the school has 5 business days to give us our child's record. Well, federal law is 45 days. So by waiving this during the COVID closures, we're now defaulting to the federal law, which is 45 days. So if you want your child's record right now during the closure time, so the school district technically has 45 days to get it to you. Now, in this same bill, Congress encouraged the school districts to give it to you as expediently as they can, but they ultimately have the federal timeline now to follow of 45 days. And that's gonna follow the same thing here with the transfer of student records if you're moving from one school district to another. And I've already had a couple of people call me about that as they've tried to move to maybe homeschooling. That 5 days is no longer gonna be applicable, right? So that's going to be waived until schools are back in session, which defaults us to the federal guideline of 45 days there as well. And I'm not even really going to talk about this last one because I'm not sure that it's really that big of a deal for anybody at this time. So another thing to quickly recap is the Federal Department of Education, along with the Office of Civil Rights and the Office of Special Education and Rehab Services, put out a guideline. It was about a 3 or 4 page document, but to just take some of the most pertinent parts. Here we know, if you look here at the top, if a child has been found eligible to receive services under IDEA, federal law tells us, just regular IDEA law tells us that the school has 30 days to determine if the child needs special education and related services and to develop the IEP, right? 60 days if it involves assessments, which often it will. But we also know that IEPs have to be reviewed annually. And I would even add in here that if a parent requests an IEP meeting, that should be held within 30 days. And that still applies. All of that, nothing was waived. So these laws still apply to us right now. So if your child is supposed to have their annual IEP during the closure time, the school should be holding the annual IEP. If you request an IEP meeting, the school should be holding an IEP meeting within 30 days. Now, here's where some of the flexibility is going to have to come into play. We as parents have the right to waive an in-person meeting, right? We can say, we can give the school district's permission to hold it via video conference or a telephone call, but that requires us waiving our right to an in-person meeting. So now, because the Department of Education didn't even waive the in-person meeting portion, we obviously, if we want to have the IEP meeting now for health purposes, we're going to have to waive that. I have been in a couple of IEP meetings via Zoom since the closures have ended or have started, and they've actually gone really well, better than I would have thought. So I strongly encourage you to consider that. And there's another flexibility built into IDEA that you may not be as aware of. When we can make changes to the child's IEP even without an actual IEP meeting. It can be done through developing a written document. So you can go back and forth via email saying, this is what I think maybe we should do. The school district can respond saying, well, this is what we think we should do. And you can actually develop this written document back and forth via email or whatever system you're using instead of holding an in-person meeting. So this too would require you to waive your right to the meeting to actually develop it. But if that's what helps get some of these changes in place, then that's what we should be doing probably, right? So let's say, for example, you're in Clovis Unified and you got the same prior written notice that I got, which was, like I said, just a general description of we're doing our best to provide FAPE at this time to the best of our abilities. Given the new limitations in place, this is what we can offer right now. Well, I could write back and say, hey, per the law, I have the right to be part of this decision. Please include me in this. I waive my right to an in-person meeting, and I'll let you do it over video conferencing, and I'll even allow you to just respond via email, and we can start developing this. And if we can reach an agreement, then I'll allow that to be put into the IEP as some sort of provisional delivery or provisional services that may be provided during the closure. So if you're not familiar with that, provisional is temporary, right? So they're not changing the long-term applications of the IEP. They're not changing the goals. They're not changing placement. They're just saying for this interim time, we're going to provisionally change the services to this and whatever the changes may need to be. But these are some flexibilities built within the law already that allow us to still meet the child's needs, but yet be flexible about how we do that. In that same document, the Department of Education says we encourage school teams and parents to work collaboratively and creatively to meet IEP timeline requirements. You know, being flexible and being collaborative is going to be ultimately very important right now. It looks like there's some chat questions. Sorry, I haven't been even looking at those. Oh, the slides, yes. So my web guy, I don't even know his official title, is obviously he's gone for the day, but in the morning I will be sending him the slides as well as there's 4 or 5 handouts at the end of this that I'm gonna show you and explain to you, and they will be posted as well. So you'll be able to get all of this through our website, hopefully by tomorrow afternoon. And there's another question, what if the district is not flexible and will not agree without an IEP meeting? Great question, Dicey, and hopefully some of the documents I show you at the end will address that. So just to kind of answer your question, and I believe it will be more fully answered towards the end here, if they're not going to be flexible, the best thing you can do is to keep data, right? The data you keep on what's happening or not happening is what you can use to later try and claim compensatory education. So compensatory education, often referred to as Comp Ed, is usually issued when the school district has not done their job properly in the first place, and now we need to make up for a lack of services that weren't provided or weren't provided appropriately. And so that's what kind of the mind frame that we're looking at here is, if they're not going to appropriately address this in the right way, then when we're able to file a claim and to go and say, look, you need to now pay to make up for what you didn't do when the school closures were in, we need to have evidence or data to back that up. So some of the forms I'm going to show you later are ways to collect some of that data, but even more importantly, you can use them to actually work with your child to try and stop some of that regression in the first place. Okay. Is it within my rights as a parent to delay or postpone an IEP? Absolutely. You always have the right to say, I can't attend right now. I don't think it would be meaningful right now, right? You can waive the IEP meeting. Now, that being said, if the school district feels that it's extremely important to hold an IEP meeting and you will not attend it, they technically, in very rare instances, can hold the IEP meeting without you. But that requires them to show that they've made every effort possible to get you to attend the meeting, and they'd have to justify why it was so important to hold it without you being there. And if you have a logical reason of why it wouldn't be important or pertinent or helpful to have an IEP meeting right now, then they would be very hard pressed to actually win that argument. So I don't anticipate too many school districts actually holding an IEP meeting without your attendance, but I do want to make you aware of it. But if you don't want to have the IEP meeting right now for whatever reason, then you have the right to waive that, yes. Okay, so one thing I do want to talk about is compensatory education. So, sorry, I skipped a little far here. I'm not really going to talk about reevaluations unless anybody has a specific question about that, about evaluations or assessments. I can go back to that slide if you do. I do want to talk about compensatory education because that's where most of the questions I've been getting are about. So these are not actual theories. These are just things, this is my opinion. So this slide is not law at all. This is just me from different webinars that I've attended in the last week or so, talking to different attorneys throughout the country. There seems to be two different theories developing. So I've kind of divided them into these two categories. So the first one is more of a punitive theory, right? Usually, before all of these closures happened, we would really only be talking about compensatory education if we're trying to, in a sense, punish the school district, right? For saying, look, you had a chance to do it right and you didn't. So now you have to pay for somebody else to try and pick that up and make up for what you caused, the harm you caused by not doing it right in the first place. And so if we look at that theory, attorneys are saying the district didn't do anything wrong. The district didn't cause the school to have to close down. The district didn't make it so that the only way your child could receive instruction was through a computer, right? That's not their fault. And because there's only so many options available to them, they're doing the best they can. Therefore, there's not a whole lot of compensatory services that should be offered. Because as long as they tried to do their best with what they had, then that's no reason to punish them. But then the other theory, it's not punitive at all. We're not punishing anybody. We're just saying FAPE has a standard that has been made very clear. FAPE has to be based on the student's needs, the needs that arise because of their disability. It can't be based on what resources are available to the district. So it's not the district's fault that their only resources is to provide instruction online, but we're not punishing them. We're just saying, look, during this time, you couldn't deliver FAPE. So because of that, we need to look at ways to make up for the harm that was caused when FAPE could not be delivered. And I've read both the Clovis and the Fresno Unified's prior written notice that they issued, and both of them in there recognize or admit, I guess, that they're going to do the best that they can, even though they may not be delivering full FAPE right now. They're doing the best that they can. So they're kind of in a way recognizing it's going to be really hard for us to deliver FAPE to everybody at this time. And so I'm not sure which standard or which theory, again, these aren't official standards or official theories. These are just me thinking, I'm noticing these two fields developing. It may end up being some sort of a hybrid, and that's kind of what I anticipate. I think that courts are going to be very forgiving of school districts who did try to do their best. But if the child has shown a lot of regression or other things that would lead to compensatory services, then they may be offering, they may award that even if the school district had done their best. And so with those two theories in mind, and again, they're not official legal theories. I can advance the slide here. I have lots of screens up, so it gets kind of tricky to advance a slide. These are things that I think are compensatory claims. Those of us who may want to bring them later, this is the factors that I think they're going to look at. And the reason I say I think is because we don't have any precedent for these particular types of claims, right? We have precedents for claims that are strictly punitive, saying, look, you didn't do it right, so now you have to pay for somebody else to, but we don't really have too many cases to look at where the school had to close down. There are a few with things like natural disasters and things like that, and how the courts responded to those, but those are very few. So gathering from all of that research, talking to some other attorneys, these are some of the factors I think we should keep in mind. First of all, the student's level prior to and after the closure. Now, and you have to think about this in many different facets, right? Their level in math, and maybe in different parts of math, in reading, in social skills, in whatever, right? So they may have particular levels in all these different areas. Where were they right before the closure, and where are they right after the closure? Is there a big difference? Is the difference that they made progress, or that they regressed? And so that's what we're going to call regression. This next one is referred to quite often as rate of recoupment, right? So the courts use that term to look at how fast can they regain the skill. So if you want to break that down more, you could say, what was the student's rate of progress during the closure? How quickly could they learn while the school was closed? And how quickly are they able to pick it up after school comes back in, right? I would also look at how fast were they learning it before the closure, actually. So you've got 3 time frames to look at. How quickly could they learn before? What was their rate of learning during? And are they able to pick up the pace and relearn it again fast when they get back at school? So if their rate of recoupment, if they can recoup those skills at a faster rate, then you'll have less likely to need and less likely to be awarded compensatory education. So hopefully those 2 things make sense, because those are usually the 2 big things that courts look at, or those top 2. But these are some other things I think that we need to keep in mind. Are there any new needs or any new areas of deficit that have come about as a result of issues related to distance learning, or that arose during the school closure? Is there something, was your student particularly agitated that their schedule was disrupted, and so you were unable to even try to teach them during the time, or have them sit in front of the computer and talk to their teacher, right? There's all these different things that, because of their disability, causes them to maybe have a more difficult time accessing this distance learning model. Were there any specific skills that deteriorated or were lost, especially keeping in mind emerging skills? So maybe it wasn't a skill that they had mastered or they had completely figured out yet, but was it something they were on the cusp of learning? So that's another factor that plays into comp ed, is if they were just about ready to learn it, they were showing all of this progress, they were getting to the point where we could say, ooh, this particular skill or this whole goal or this sub-skill within this goal has been mastered, and then it got lost during the closure times. That would help in a claim for compensatory education. Look at the time period that they went without a particular service. Maybe your school district has, or your particular speech pathologist has been great about coming into your home every week via the computer and doing, 20 minutes of speech therapy with your kid, but you haven't had any OT sessions. Maybe you haven't had both. But think of each particular service that your child would receive. How long have they been without each of those services? Was it the entire time? Was it just part of the time? Are there any other factors that may have impacted the student's progress or their lack of progress? The reason this is important is because any claim to, or any discussion about compensatory education has to revolve around the student's disability. So if it wasn't because of their disability that they need this, then the school doesn't have to pay for it, right? So if there was maybe there was also a divorce going on at the time of the closures. If the school can argue that part of the reason the child didn't do so well wasn't necessarily all distance learning, but it was somewhat affected by the divorce that was happening or the sickness that they had, that's not really related to their disability. So that might play a factor in deciding. Justifications for not providing the amount or type of services required. So this is where I think the courts may have, if you do end up at court, which I've said this many, many times in my class, I'm not a big advocate of due process unless that's the road that you've ended at, right? There's so many opportunities to solve our differences or resolve things prior to filing for due process. So that being said, though, the courts, I think, will look at, well, if they couldn't provide it, then they couldn't provide it, right? Was it absolutely impossible to do that at this time? That may play a large factor in weighing things. And were there any attempts to address the lack of progress by revising the IEP? Did the school actually meet to talk about, okay, if we can't provide this, then maybe we should change the goal so that you have something else the child can work on, right? So I haven't done this formally with the school, but I'm not working on a lot of things for my son because I don't know how to teach him those things. But there are other things I do know how to teach him, so I'm teaching him those instead. But it would probably be much better if we had an IEP meeting and said, hey, during this closure time, let's change the focus of the goals to be more realistically taught in the home setting or something like that. Okay, so that's really the end of that. The other one was this same thing, but laid out in a prettier format, but harder to read because it was smaller type. So I'm gonna stop this screen share and I'm going to share with you a couple of forms. Again, if you have questions, please unmute yourself and ask, type it in with the chat. Yeah, I think I've answered all of the chats. Okay. Sorry, it takes me a little while to find the right one. Okay, so this is goal log. No, the service log, sorry. Okay, so this is not something that I created. I found this, and I will include the link to this on the Bren website. But this was a way somebody put together of, you can put a week's worth of what's been happening on one page so that you can kind of keep track of things. So what was the classroom time, right? Was there a time that the teacher said, okay, everybody, 10 o'clock, we're gonna meet on Google Classroom or something, and what services were provided. And then they've also got a weekly service summary here where they've got all these different types of services, and if you needed to, I'm sure you could add to this. What was specified in the IEP and what was actually delivered this week. So maybe you got 20 minutes, they don't even have minutes, they have hours per week. Let's say you got 1 hour per week of OT. Which around here doesn't happen very often. But let's say you did in your child's IEP. That's what they're supposed to get, but the OT's only been able to get them to come online and pay attention for 10 minutes. So what did that actually look like, right? So you're comparing the two. That's very helpful, I think. What should have been delivered had they been in school and what's actually being delivered. And then a summary of appropriate or accessible services. So what services were delivered in a way that were appropriate and accessible, what were delivered in a way that was not appropriate or accessible, and what specifically made them not appropriate or accessible. Did services delivered further my child's education as specifically related to the agreed upon IEP goals? So just at the end of the week, kind of summarizing what's been happening and whether it seemed to be effective or not. So this is a way, one way that somebody has put together. I have a couple more that I've worked on that I'll share with you. Okay, so here's the goal log. Okay, so this is just a very simple form where at the top of the page, you could list what's the goal that we're going to work on, how was it written in the IEP, how have we adapted it for distance learning? Did we change the goal at all? Did we change some of its focus or its accommodations or anything like that? What equipment might be needed if you're going to work on this goal, right? So it's all right there at the top of the page. And then you have all these little boxes for tracking it. So here's the date, you'd put that in. If you're working on just one particular sub-skill within that goal, you could list that here. And then here's the little cheat sheet for how you can, you know, make your marks without having to write full sentences. We tried it once and he got it right, right? You can put a plus mark if he does it correctly, a minus mark if they didn't do it correctly. If you had to use some sort of a prompt, you could abbreviate the prompts that were used. Maybe he did it correctly, but only after I gave him a verbal prompt. So that would be a plus mark with VP next to it, right? So this is one way you can kind of keep track. And even if you're not working on it every day, even if you're just showing what this could literally do is show either a rate of retention of a skill or a rate of regression. So it's not your job to deliver the education and the faith at this time, right? Although if you're able to and stop your child from regressing as a mom, I highly recommend it. But if you're unable to do that, or even if you're trying and it's just not working, this can show that, look, the first time we tried it, he was able to do it pretty close maybe to what the school predicted he could do it at the closure, but we've tried it every week and look, every week it's going less correct and less correct and less a number of them correct. So again, this could be helpful if you need to have something to show there was regression. And it's not just here, day 1 and day 60. I've got points of regression along the way to show that even with trying to keep this skill up to date, we just weren't able to do it without the services the school could offer. So that's one option. The other option, I've got a daily log. So that one would just be per goal. This one here would be more like printing it out each day you plan to do some schoolwork or that you want to track or that you would track things. So if you're going to track it, you have to track it consistently, right? We can't just choose to track it when we want to, because this one kind of takes into account what did the school try to provide for you. So this would be each day you'd have to use a different sheet if you used this one. Did you receive any emails, texts, or other messages from the school? If you did, who was it from? And what kind of message was it? So we've been getting a lot of them, probably 2-3 times a week from my son's teacher that just says, hey, and it's a mass email sent out to the whole class, but just says, hey, hoping everybody's doing okay. Let me know if you need anything. I call that a check-in, right? There's been a couple of them where there's been something attached. Here's an assignment. Please try and get it finished and send it back in. Others have been, hey, let's meet, or me, you know, them responding to my request to meet and just to coordinate. So that's what that would be. And maybe, you know, there's some other reason, and any notes you may want to put about that. But that helps you track how often the school is actually reaching out to provide something. This next thing is what kind of online learning was being offered, right? So you've got what was available, the start time and the end time. So maybe they had their Google Classroom that was from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Did you actually attend? If you did, what time did you start attending and what time did you end? So my son's teacher had a classroom this morning that was from 9 to 10. We lasted from about, we didn't get on till 9:15 and we lasted till almost 9:45 till Bren was like, nope, not doing it anymore, right? He's shutting down. So even though the school offered an hour, Bren was only able to access it for about a half an hour. And then what was it that they did? And then was it helpful? Yes or no, and why or why not? So here I would put, it wasn't really helpful because Bren was unable to pay attention to the screen. He didn't realize that the teacher was actually talking to him through the computer, right? Something like that. So, oh, and I divided this up. Sorry, I kind of jumped down. That would actually be your classroom, what I just discussed. And this might be office hours or something, right? So I've made this based on what we've been offered. So my son's teacher has office hours, and every week she does like one classroom thing so far about. And so that's what I've noticed. So that's what I put here. and then another little box to kind of describe what has kept your child from fully engaging or actually learning, right? So what have been the things that have made distance learning difficult, where maybe FAPE wasn't being delivered. Okay, so the question here is, what if the teacher stops doing Zoom or drop-in class? Then I think if you have these, even if you've already had, say, 2 or 3 Zoom classes, if you can remember when they were, go back and show that, look, on these days and these days they did, and you've got notes saying why it wasn't helpful for your child. If they stop doing them, and then your log stops, right? Maybe she's still offering office hours, but not classroom time. And that kind of supports your place of they weren't being offered either anything, or even you noticed it wasn't being helpful to him, so you stopped providing it, right? So if you plan on starting to keep track, I would print some of these out and go back and try and remember what has been offered during this first month, so that you can show either we keep trying and it's not working, we keep trying and it is working, or we stop trying and you stop trying, right? On both ends, maybe. I'm sure many of us started all gung-ho, I'm gonna make him work on every goal at least 5 times a day, and now we're lucky if we do it once a day, right? And same with the school district. They may be finding that this online delivery is really not feasible for a lot of students. But I do think if we don't keep track of it, then there's no evidence of what happened or didn't happen, right? So that's what's really gonna help you if you really plan on or want to try and get compensatory services later. It'll have to be based on what evidence is available. Now, if you've been, I'm sure many of you have been in IEP meetings where you want their data, right? Well, where's the data that shows you worked on the goal? It's now your job to keep that data. It's your job to show whether or not this is happening, right? Now, I'm not saying it's your job to work on the goal, but if you want to be able to show regression, then you're going to have to every once in a while work on the goal. Now, as a mom, not as an attorney, I'm putting my mom hat on now. The last thing we want is to see regression, right? I mean, regression is powerful evidence to get comp ed, but comp ed is never as good as just not regressing in the first place. So if there's any way you can step in place of the teacher, in place of the SLP, and provide that so that your child doesn't have to regress, yeah, you might lose out on some comp ed, but you probably don't need it as much, right? And your child didn't have to move backwards. So maybe your goal can be to try and hold on. Maybe you don't make a lot of progress, but maybe you don't fall as far behind, right? Maybe you can keep some of those skills in place. If the Zoom class is not helpful for the child due to their disability, I completely understand that because that's my son. Should the teacher or service provider offer one-on-one parent coaching so the parent can work with the child to meet their goals? Okay, so when I kind of proposed this to my school district, I was given a blanket response of the parent is not responsible for providing FAPE, which is true. They are really not allowed to project their duty onto you. However, if you're willing to work with them and meet with the teacher or the speech language pathologist to get some tips, to get some ideas, then yes. So that's something the team could very much meet to say, let's have a brief IEP meeting and talk about what services can be delivered to the parent so that I can now offer the benefit to my child. So if you've taken my class, you already know there's a section in every IEP that is supports and services offered to somebody else on behalf of the student. In there, we can do staff training, we can do teacher training, we can even do parent training. So parent training has already been part of IDEA for years, for decades, really. You can have that training written into the IEP at any time, so why not now? Of course you can. They can offer you the services so that your child can benefit from them. Now, you may require that in this unique time, whereas before you didn't need the training because you didn't have to take the place of the SLP or the teacher. But now that you do, maybe now it's very appropriate for that service to be added to the IEP as an interim service. So they've taken it upon themselves to, not all school districts, but I'm aware of a couple of them, who have taken it upon themselves to say, because we can't provide all services right now. Here's what we can offer. Here is a interim service. They've made it very clear they're not changing the IEP in those prior written notices, but here's the services that can be offered during the closure. Why can't we change some of that? If they can change it, then, and they shouldn't be changing it without our input, first of all. That's my opinion of the law. But if that can be changed, and indeed it can, it should just include our input, why can't they add a service instead of just taking them away? They absolutely can. So that's something you can send out a request for an IEP meeting to address the services, specifically what can be offered to give you training or consultation during this time. Okay, so back to this document. Were there, here's another box just to keep track of what was it that kept your child from being able to fully engage in what was being offered. So we're not only tracking what's being offered and how often you're utilizing what's being offered, but you're explaining why even attending for a half an hour this morning, maybe class was offered for an hour, like in our case, but we were only able to sit in front of the computer for a half an hour. Of that sitting in front of the computer time, he probably only paid attention for about 5 collective minutes, and not a 5-minute session, 5 minutes collectively during the 30 minutes we were sitting there. So how helpful is that really when you only pay attention for 30 seconds at a time, adding up to maybe 5 minutes? It's not going to be very useful. So that's the kind of thing we would describe here, to keep track of the fact that yes, the school is trying, but what they're trying isn't working. My child's still not learning anything. Were there any alternative means provided or even suggested? You could even write down here, I suggested this and I was told no. Or the school suggested this, I gave it a try and it didn't really work. So who suggested it? Who actually delivered it? So was it the district via the computer? Was it the parent? And maybe it was a little bit of both. Like today, my son's speech therapist worked with him for about 10 minutes, but it required me sitting here redirecting him and prompting him. So I would probably say it was delivered by both of us. Brief description of it, and was it less effective, more effective, or no difference? Because again, we're saying here, an alternative means. Did we try something different this week? And then a space for any other information. So this is an idea of a way for you to each day quickly, I tried to make it quick and easy where you just check off boxes and make small notes to just quickly keep track of what's been offered, what's been utilized, how effective has it been, so that you can keep a log. Because again, if you remember, the factors we needed to keep in mind when we're asking for comp ed are rate of regression, rate of recoupment, but also all those other factors about, was the school doing everything that they could? Were they trying to truly deliver FAPE? Was the child's disability making it even more difficult to access FAPE via distance learning or whatever it is? Those are things we're gonna have to look at. I do have a couple more things to share. Again, please ask questions along the way as they come up. So this was shared with me, by the director of SWAN, Dr. Nicholson. I don't think she developed it. There's a citation at the bottom here for positivelyautism.com to give them the credit and copyright as well. But it's another way of tracking data on goals. So what I like about this particularly is they've got their little prompts up here as to what, what little, if you put a PV, that means there was partial verbal prompting happening or something, right? But it breaks it down into the different skills. So this is something I think if you've got a goal you're working on that involves a bunch of different steps, I would think the school could help you develop a sheet like this, right? You could have a quick meeting with the teacher and she could tell you, or she could put it together and explain it to you about all the different steps that are in one skill that they're trying to learn. And then you can start keeping track. You could develop this all by yourself. I'm sure most of us are smart enough to figure that out, but I think it's very important to get the school district working with us to get their input as to how we can work on a specific goal. So if you've got a goal that incorporates a lot of steps, a sheet like this could be very useful. I was told by Dr. Nicholson that on this website, I think you can access it. It is free, according to what I was told, I believe, and they have blank ones too you can access. And all of these will be available on the Bren website, hopefully by tomorrow afternoon, if not tomorrow morning. So that, my friends, is all I have for you. Are there any other questions that you have for me? I'm going to unmute you. So, but if it gets too noisy with dogs and kids, I'll just mute you all again. But I'm going to unmute you for a little bit. Anybody got questions for me?
I wrote one in the chat.
Oh, did I not get to it? Okay, does it count or hold weight that the teacher and I made modifications to the IEP without the director or school psych? We did CC all who would need to be advised about the changes. Okay, so that's interesting. Usually teachers won't do that without some sort of admin. Did you actually sign?
It's okay, Mama.
Okay, so it's not officially changed IEP then without the signature, I wouldn't think, but I think it's absolutely appropriate thing to do. To say, look, during this time we have to modify this goal, right? So if you notice, even on, sorry, I'm gonna do some muting again. So unmute yourself if you do have questions. It does get noisy real quick. I'm gonna screen share, I think it was goal log, the goal log that I threw together today. I even have a section for here, how was it adapted for distance learning, right? So here was and the reason I put that in here was, I think here's the goal that we would have worked on had they stayed in class, but here's how we changed it for adaptive learning, or for distance learning. So with my son, I use him as an example all the time because that's where I am, right? That's what I'm working with. He has a goal about counting change, but we're doing it a little differently at home than they would in class. So it's not a big difference, but it is a slight difference. So anything that I did to change how we're working on it, I would write that here. And if you've worked with your teacher to discuss those, even better, right? Because now it involves both parties and it's probably much better developed and more appropriate for the child. So I do want to reiterate here that our ultimate goal is to stop regression, not have tons of evidence so that we get compensatory education later after our child has regressed. However, regression is a very real possibility for almost all of our kids. And even with our best efforts, I think we're going to see regression, but we need to keep track of that. But Laurie, does that answer your question? Oh, and it was a private question. I'm sorry, Laurie, I should not have read it out loud to everybody. I try to do that and notice that. I apologize. Anything else for me? Okay, you're unmuted now, everyone. So don't say anything you don't want me to hear. No. Yeah, any other questions about comp ed, closures, anything like that?
I'm having.
I have a question.
Yeah.
All at once.
Hi, Kara.
Hi, Arthur.
How are you?
My question was answered because mine was the IEP. I'm just not in a place right now to have an IEP as a parent. Like I don't want to go over all the things right now. Like I have too much going on in my household, and having all those faces stare at me on Zoom is gonna completely freak me out. So
it is. I've been in a couple where it's been like 20 people on the screen there. So yeah. And there is a lot going on in everybody's life. So, but yes, you can waive and say, I know I'm supposed to have it every February or whatever it is, right? I guess it would be more like March or April or May, but I will waive that timeline. So, and as long as you sign that paper, everything's hunky-dory on the school district side. Anyway.
Hey, Jody, I have a question about your IEPs that you've been attending, because I have one on Friday. And have they been like when they look at it, are they looking at going back to school, or are they like trying to put it like services in place what they can do online right now?
Good question. So to be completely honest with you, the couple of IEPs I have attended have not even been about the closure things. They were about problems that were arising even before the closure, and that the client and myself both agree we want to get this taken care of so it's not a problem after the closure, right? We're going to have enough issues when the closure ends. So, but I would anticipate that if you're talking about what's offered right now, I would want to have a very frank conversation about, look, I realize that there are very few options available, but let's talk about what they all are, much like we would placement, right? If you've been in my class, we've talked about placement, how the school district is supposed to talk to you about every option that would be available and then narrow it down to what's most appropriate. So although this technically isn't changing their placement, and I don't want anybody to think that it is because we don't want this to be a change of placement, but I would approach it much the same way in that I would want to have an exhaustive and frank discussion of what are all the possibilities, right? Even the ones the school district doesn't want to talk about, like, what if I found a private provider who can come into my home and provide service when the school district is unwilling or unable to, right? If that's a possibility, I would at least want them to have the discussion with me, right? About why would that not be appropriate? Because again, the discussion should not be based on what's available to the school district, but what's needed for the child. Now we have to kind of have a hybrid discussion right now because what's needed for the child is a lot of times not even a real availability right now, right? Because my child needs one-on-one, well, maybe not one-on-one, but he needs in-person instruction because this computer thing is not working. But they can't offer that right now. And I can't even, there's not even a private provider that I can find to provide it right now. But if I could, I would definitely have that part of the conversation. So again, just discussing everything that's available and then laying out every reason why, what would make each of these things not appropriate for the child or make it appropriate for the child. So again, if you've taken my course, we've talked a lot about present levels and how you can be prepared before the meeting. I would do the same thing here. Before the IEP meeting, I would list every kind I could think of, every way of delivering services right now, and what would be beneficial and not beneficial about each of those ways. And that way, if it's a Zoom or something like that, you can screen share. I've screen shared documents on that, even when I'm not the host. And I can say, look, I put together this document and I'd like to talk about it. So yeah, does that answer that question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else before we all break for dinner? No?
Good.
I have a question. My child is in the middle of an assessment for an initial IEP, and they want to have a meeting next month, but they said they wouldn't determine eligibility.
Okay, so I do have to clarify. I'm not able to give out legal advice, right? I can only speak in general terms.
Of course. Yeah.
So I'm tempted to ask you a whole slew of questions right now, and I have to stop myself because now it turns into legal advice. That being said, you are always welcome to set up a consultation with me where I can do that in a private setting. So I'm going to go back to screen share. It was the screen that I said in the PowerPoint. I'm not going to need to talk about this unless there are specific questions.
Sorry.
So let me go back to that and find that particular screen. Okay, so if we're looking at, these are reevaluations, but let's talk about that because it kind of leads into that. So a reevaluation has to happen. If your child is found eligible, they have to have a reevaluation every 3 years, right? Unless the parent waives that. We do know that when appropriate, a reevaluation can be conducted with a review of existing evaluation data. So if you have any information, be it from a private therapist or from the school, from what they already have done, that can be used. And specifically, a reevaluation can occur without a meeting and without parental consent if all they're doing are looking at past data, right? Now, an initial assessment, that is going to be a lot more tricky. So we do know from these previous slides here, our state guideline, our state bill that passed said they don't have to finish or do the assessment. They only have to put the plan together until school's back in session. And the real reason behind that is they need a classroom setting in order to do an evaluation, right? They need to have the setting in which the child learns to do the evaluation. So even if you were to throw out the argument of, okay, so right now they learn in the home, how they can't come to your home, right? They're not even allowed to come to your home to do the evaluation for health reasons. So it creates an impossibility. So really, you were, again, oh, see, I can't ask questions. Set up a consultation because I got some questions for you. But if you were in the, I would think that somebody in the middle of one had already received an assessment plan and it had already started. But you run into the same issue of there is no educational environment that they can come in and assess in. Even arguably with the home being the environment, they can't come into your home. So maybe, and I'm postulating here, I don't know for sure, but if our shelter-in-place orders get slightly lifted, maybe not all the way lifted, but maybe slightly, and now if they can answer certain questions, then they can come into your home one person at a time. Maybe then you might have some sort of an argument of this is his learning environment right now, so do the assessment, but then they'd have to redo the assessment once the learning environment changes again. But the initial assessment, that's the really tricky one. That is the one that is gonna get, I think, lost in the cracks here. Now, Secretary DeVos, she didn't waive any of, or suggest any waivers for IDEA in its entirety. She did, however, suggest that for students who are children who are reaching that age of 3, because right, you get those early childhood services, and then at 3 years old, hopefully most of you are aware of this. When you turn 3, now it's not early childhood anymore. Now the school district's responsible for providing the services. She did suggest a waiver of that time frame where they can keep retaining those early childhood services beyond the age of 3. Even if they shouldn't, technically, right, during the closure times. She did not say anything about that initial evaluation, and that has a couple of, I've already talked to a couple of attorneys where we've been like, what does that mean for kids that are doing initial evaluations? Does anything like that apply to them? And if it does, what does it look like? She did not address it at all. So I'm still left to say, I don't know. So it's a very long answer to reach the conclusion of, I don't know. Sorry.
Thank you.
But I tried to provide some background for you before just saying I don't know. All right. Anything else? I said this was mostly a Q&A. I usually have more than enough to talk about to last 2 to 3 hours. Those of you who've taken my course know I can talk about special education all day long. But I am, again, more than willing to answer questions of general sorts if anybody else has something.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Before all the closures, I had received my son's progress report and I saw the regression. So I asked for service logs beginning of February from the district and I did not receive them. And then with everything going on, I haven't received any information and no one's reached out to me for the distance learning or anything. What
So
can I do at this point?
I would classify that as a request for your child's records. And if you remember, the state law used to be 5 days. You ask for the records, they have 5 days to give it to you. But now it's 45 days. So I would start, the first thing I would probably do is count the days. Has it been 45 days since you asked for it? And if it hasn't, or even if either way, you'll want to send an email probably. I would send an email saying it's been X amount of days since I made this request. Even if it's not quite 45 yet, just reminding them, even though the state law has been lifted, federal law still applies, and that should be delivered within 45 days, and that's in 5 days, or you're past it by yeah, that sounds like a record request. That's usually a pretty easy thing to do, just reminding them about the time frame and that you made the request. Now, they may have just completely lost your request in the mad shuffle of March 13th, right? I mean, if you remember, it was Friday the 13th, which was completely
right.
apt, right? For all the schools to really, that's when all the schools started shutting down here locally anyway.
My request was given to them beginning of February. So I'm going on 90 days.
Yeah, so I would write them. That's the first step I would do. I would write them and remind them. They probably, in all honesty, they probably lost your request in the madness, and just make it again. And do it in writing. Everything, I always suggest doing things in writing. Okay, there are a couple things. Dicey gave us an FYI. CVRC is adding hours for clients. So that's nice. Another one, daughters in kindergarten. A SPED teacher gave us her distance learning packet for 4 weeks. Okay, again, I can't give specific advice to specific situations, but let's see. None of those addresses goals. When I asked her, she asked us to give accommodations and modifications, even though she suggested ways, still the packet did not address the goals. Sorry, I'm reading this real fast. Okay, so that is definitely a call me for a consultation type of question. Far too many specifics for me to just give a general answer. But to really boil it down to a general term, I would make things like that here on pages such as, sorry, I'm not even sharing the right screen with you anymore. If you had like a goal log, say, like you're telling me things like the school district has set goals that are just too hard for my kid, or are sending assignments that are just too difficult. You could replace goal here with the assignment, right? Here's the assignment that was given. These are ways I tried to adapt it, and here's what happened when we tried to do it. And you can just keep a list of, we tried to work on it. I tried on day 1. We were too frustrated, so I didn't come back till day 5, change the date, and show a bunch of minus marks, and just show, even if it's just way beyond her ability, just add a note that says something about that. That's what I would do. I would somehow keep a log of, we got these assignments, we gave it a try, it was way beyond his or her level, and try and explain the reasons why. Oh, Dicey, what do you mean by service notes? I'm looking at your question here. What if they've never made any service notes? What do you mean by that? And you can unmute yourself or type it, either way. Maybe she stepped away. I'm wondering if by service notes she's talking about like how they've worked on it in the past, maybe?
Yeah. My name is Sue, and I'm Dicey's mom.
Oh, okay.
So I think that what she was talking about when she asked about the progress and things like that, they had no notes at the IEP meeting to show what they've done.
And that happens a lot, right? So I've had some teachers for my son where they're great at keeping data. They've got all these pluses and checks and minus marks, or however they did it, to show that they've been working on it, and others that have nothing to show progress. So then what that does is, it begs the question, first of all, have they actually been working on this even before the closures happened? But I don't think that should stop you from trying at least a small handful of times, even if it's just once a week, running through each goal once a week just to see, look, we've tried to attend your online classes. I've tried to get my kid to pay attention as often as I could. And then I'm trying to show, is he retaining any of these skills by once a week measuring, can he do the goal? I would still do that myself. Now, again, these aren't going to be like super, I don't know if I told you this, yeah, I say it again, but these aren't going to be like, yes, we'll have a slam dunk case. There's no such thing. But without anything to show the regression, it's going to be a little bit harder, right? So I suggest, even in the absence of the school having progress notes, still create your own if you're able to.
Okay,
It
thank
shouldn't
you.
hopefully take too much time. I know we're all so busy and you're going, wait, you want me to keep data, Jody? I don't think so. I know it's hard. Trust me. I know. All right. Anything else? Again, it was nice just to see some faces and talk to some people. So thank you for coming online and talking to me, or at least listening to me. Okay, so check out our website tomorrow. I will put it here in the chat if you're for some reason not familiar with our website. It's very easy. So there's our website. We are part of San Joaquin College of Law, so that's what the SJCL is for, and .edu because we're an educational institution. In fact, let me show you real quickly, just in case I see a couple people on your cameras, like you're writing it down. So that tells me you're probably not familiar with our website. So let me show you, because there is going to be a little subtab you're gonna have to click. So actually I can just, okay, so if you start at the law school's website, it'll take you to SJCL. And then here at the top, there's this Bren link. You can click right on that. So sjcl.edu, click on the Bren link, and that takes you to our homepage of the clinic. Here you can find out about the next classes going on. So right now we are open for summer class registration. If you want to take that class, you can send it to that. The register now button is right here, and the dates of the different topics are here. That is free. The book that we use in conjunction with the class, there's a link to that on Amazon. That is not free, but the class itself is, and you don't need the book to take the class. I do think it's helpful, but it's not required. And there's also information about setting up a consultation. But here's where you're gonna find the information from today's, from this, for if you want those, you know, worksheets and the slides and whatnot. You click on this coronavirus link. So everything that we're sharing right now during these times that are specific to COVID, the COVID closure, are going to be on this extra COVID page, because it's not something we're going to need long term, right? So we've already done 3 webinars. This is our 4th. So you'll see from this webinar, there was a bunch of handouts that were offered there. So you can watch the webinar and get access to the handouts. Then there's 2 other webinars. These 2 here, we're talking specifically about changes in law or guidance in law that was suggested, or that was issued from the state or the federal departments. And in those 2, we talk about a lot of the resources that you can find online. And by resources, I'm talking about legal documents, but the links to those are down here as well. So probably tomorrow afternoon, this new webinar will be placed up here at the top with similar links like this to all of the handouts that I've shown you. So if you do want to start keeping track of some of these things, you'll be able to access them. And you know, if you just didn't get enough of me and you want to listen to me again, you can watch the whole webinar all over again. All right, so thank you all for joining tonight. It was a pleasure to see those of you who are familiar faces. It's so good to see your faces again. And for the new ones, it was nice to meet you in this virtual way. And keep following us. If there's any further changes, I try to update it on our Facebook page. Which again, if you're on our homepage of the Bren Clinic, if you're not already following us on Facebook, there's a link to that as well. So you can follow us. I do try to give updates and articles periodically to keep up the price of what's happening. So everybody have a good night, and I will talk to you later.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you.